The U.S. scrambles to ensure trust with its allies following leaks of classified military documents. Seoul's top office refused any possibility of U.S. wiretapping, as speculated by those documents. The Bank of Korea freezes its key interest rate at 3.5% on seemingly stabilizing inflation and concerns of a further economic slowdown. Japan's 2023 diplomatic blue book omits its previous pledge to uphold apologies over colonizing Korea. Good afternoon. We start with the latest on the controversial leaks of U.S. military documents. Among them is a document on South Korea's alleged plan to deliver weapons without the destination specified. Washington scrambles to ensure trust with Seoul, reaffirming its commitment to the nation. Is ironclad. Song Yoo-jin starts us off.
The United States says it is engaging with allies and partners regarding the recent leak of its highly classified military documents. The leak has been causing alarm around the world as some documents show the U.S. could have been eavesdropping on key allies like Israel and South Korea.
U.S. officials across the interagency are engaging with allies and partners at high levels over this, including to reassure them of our commitment to safeguarding intelligence and the fidelity of securing our partnerships as well.
When asked about how the leak could impact South Korea-U.S. relations, the spokesperson said Washington's commitment towards Seoul remains ironclad. He went on to emphasize that South Korea is one of Washington's most important partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Defense ministers of the two countries held a phone call on Tuesday morning at the request of the U.S., during which it promised close communication and cooperation with Seoul regarding the matter. But concerns are growing in South Korea as another document related to the country has been found online. On Monday, local media outlets reported on a printed document titled ROK 155 Delivery Timeline. The one-page document, dated February 27th, includes a 72-day timeline of when and how South Korea will deliver 330,000 artillery shells. Though it does not mention the final destination of the 155mm shells, a previously leaked conversation between President Yoon Suk-yeol's then Secretary for Foreign Affairs and his National Security Advisor suggests it could be Ukraine. Citing the leaked documents, the New York Times detailed the two advisors' conversation where the Foreign Affairs Secretary expresses concern that the U.S. would not be the end user if South Korea complies with its request for ammunition. In February, the U.S. had reportedly inquired about purchasing ammunition from South Korea, but Seoul was worried about supplies reaching Ukraine and going against its long-standing policy of not supplying weapons to countries at war. The National Security Advisor then suggested selling 330,000 rounds of 155mm artillery shells to Ukraine's neighbor Poland as a roundabout solution to the issue. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
And South Korea's presidential office has been quick to respond to the controversy surrounding the leaked documents. It ruled out any possibility of Washington wiretapping Seoul's intelligence and claims that much of related reports are fabricated. Oh Soo-young reports.
South Korea's presidential office has dismissed concerns that the United States has been wiretapping the country's National Security Office. This follows media reports over alleged Pentagon documents leaked online. In a phone call with Yonhap News on Tuesday, a presidential official said eavesdropping and wiretapping of internal conversations at the top office building in Yongsan is impossible, saying that a highly stringent anti-wiretapping system was put in place when relocating from the Blue House last year. The official also brushed off concerns that the contents of National Security Office meetings held in the underground of the Yongsan building were compromised, drawing a line on whether a conversation between two senior personnel took place within the premises. This comes after classified documents seemingly leaked from the Pentagon were reported in US media. The documents appear to contain conversations between South Korean national security officials. The intelligence leak has stirred controversy over whether the US is wiretapping its allies and comes just over 2 weeks before Yoon's summit with Joe Biden in Washington, D.C. Seoul's presidential office has maintained that the reports are unconfirmed and are likely to have been fabricated. It says discussions with the US and verification of the details should be prioritized.
Obviously, there's a red line. Every state has them. It accepts, spying and espionage even from friends and allies up to a certain point. But at some point, there's a sort of, unspoken code of conduct or an unspoken set of rules that states are supposed to follow. And I think South Korea, will want to reiterate that to the United States.
First Deputy Director of the National Security Office, Kim Tae-ho, told reporters on Tuesday that Seoul and Washington agreed there has been tampering of details in the documents, and the leak cannot be a variable in Seoul and Washington's relations. He said that since the two allies are closely engaged in information sharing, the crisis can be turned into an opportunity to solidify trust and strengthen the cooperation system between the two countries. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has expressed deep regret toward North Korea for refusing to answer the regular inter-Korean military hotline phone calls for the fifth day. In a televised statement on Tuesday, Seoul's Unification Minister Kwon Young-se blamed Pyongyang for taking, quote, unilateral and irresponsible acts without giving any explanation, adding that they will only further isolate the regime. Kwon also condemned North Korea's use of facilities at the now-closed Kaesong Joint Industrial Complex. He said that despite continued warnings, the regime had been infringing on the property rights of South Korean companies, which goes against the inter-Korean agreements made regarding the use of the complex. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has once again ordered his military to ramp up war deterrence capabilities. According to the North State-run media on Tuesday, Kim presided over a key military meeting on Monday, where he stressed the need for practical and aggressive expansion of war deterrence, presumably referring to nuclear capabilities. The report says the meeting was convened following what it claims are increased threats posed by the aggressive acts and policies of South Korea and the United States. The regime held such key military meetings in February and March, which is considered a rare move, as the North normally carries out the meeting roughly every 6 months. The Japanese government has released its diplomatic blue book for this year. However, while it made reference to South Korea's plan to compensate victims of Japan's wartime forced labor, it omitted its previous pledge to uphold apologies made in the past. Bae Eun-ji has more.
Last month, the South Korean government announced its plan to compensate Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor through a public foundation, instead of through the Japanese firms found guilty by a South Korean court. At the time, Japan's foreign minister said he hoped the solution would help restore ties between the countries, and said the Japanese government will continue to uphold the apologies it made in the past.
On this occasion, we confirm that the Japanese government continues to uphold the stance on historical recognition made by previous cabinets as a whole, including the joint declaration between Japan and South Korea made in October 1998.
But this was not included in Japan's newly published Diplomatic Blue Book, an annual report on Japan's foreign policy and activities, released on Tuesday. Regarding the issue of compensating wartime forced labor victims, the report explained that Seoul and Tokyo have been discussing it since President Yoon Suk-yeol took office in May, through diplomatic channels and at the recent summit between the two countries' leaders. But the report did not explain the fact that Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi has said the Japanese government will uphold the stance made by previous cabinets, including the joint declaration between South Korea and Japan in 1998. The joint statement in 1998 between former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and former Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi includes Tokyo's, quote, deep remorse and heartfelt apology for causing tremendous damage and suffering to Koreans during its colonial rule. The latest report also said South Korea has continued an illegal occupation of Dokdo Island, which they refer to as Takeshima, with no legal basis. Japan has been saying this in its annual diplomatic blue book for 6 years, since 2018. In response, South Korea's foreign ministry spokesperson said in a statement on Tuesday that Japan should immediately retract the unjust sovereignty claim to what is an integral part of South Korean territory, historically, geographically, and under international law. The ministry also called in Naoki Kumagai, the deputy chief of mission at the Japanese embassy in Seoul, to protest. 배은지, Arirang News.
Today marks the 104th anniversary of the founding of the Korean Provisional Gov't. A special event took place at Seoul Independence Park in Seoul, themed the Free Citizens of an Independent Democratic State. Some 400 people were invited to attend, including the families of independence fighters. The Korean Provisional Gov't was formed in April 1919, shortly after the March 1st independence movement and its associated protests. It played a central role in Korean independence against Japanese colonial rule until liberation 27 years later. The South Korean government has issued the highest level alert for the wildfire that broke out in the mountains in Gangneung City on the country's east coast. The fire broke out at around 8:30 Tuesday morning and is still expanding. Just after 10 a.m., the Korea Forest Service raised its wildfire response warning to the highest, level 3, and ordered residents in the area to evacuate. A level 3 alarm is issued when a wildfire is expected to damage area that exceeds 100 hectares or is estimated to take more than 24 hours to extinguish. Efforts to put out the fire are being hampered by dry weather and strong winds in the region. As widely expected, the Bank of Korea has decided to leave the interest rate unchanged on seemingly stabilizing inflation and concerns over further economic slowdown. Our Lee Dae-yeon explains.
The Bank of Korea has decided to freeze the key interest rate for now. The central bank announced the decision during Tuesday's Monetary Policy Committee meeting, keeping the base interest rate at 3.5%.
Considering inflation forecasts above the target level and financial risks expanding in major countries, we've decided to freeze the base rate and closely monitor the inflation slowdown and other economic uncertainties.
This is the second time in a row that the central bank has decided to keep the rate unchanged, with a 3.5% base rate in place for almost 3 months. Analysts say stabilizing consumer prices in South Korea was the main contributing factor behind the decision to freeze rates. The Consumer Price Index, a key gauge of inflation, rose 4.2% on year in March, marking the slowest annual rise since March 2022. Worsening economic indicators, too, are mentioned as among the reasons for the central bank's decision. The country's GDP growth rate shrunk by 0.4% in the fourth quarter of last year, mainly due to sluggish exports. The balance of trade also recorded a deficit during the first 2 months of 2023, in the red for 2 consecutive months for the first time in 11 years. The global economic crisis caused by the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and the liquidity crisis of Credit Suisse were also considered factors that stopped the BOK from imposing a rate hike. With the central bank's decision to hold the rate, the interest rate difference between South Korea and the U.S. stays at 1.5 percentage points. The last time the gap was so wide was 22 years ago and has sparked concerns that it could result in foreign capital outflow and a rise in the $1 exchange rate, leaving the possibility for more rate hikes in the near future. Lee Dae-yeon, Arirang News.
South Korea's economy is expected to see sluggish growth this year as major countries also experience a slow recovery. According to the Bank of Korea on Tuesday, the nation's economic growth this year is expected to be slightly below February's economic growth forecast of 1.6% due to the uncertainties related to China's reopening and the recovery in the IT sector. Major global economies such as the United States and Japan are likely to experience downward pressure due to the bank crises and low global demand. Meanwhile, data from the Korea Customs Service shows that the nation's trade deficit has already reached more than $25 billion this year, around 54% of last year's record high trade deficit, as exports dropped almost 9% on year during the April 1st to 10th period. Now turning over to the global economy, a rare optimistic outlook by the World Bank as the chief has sadly raised this year's global growth forecast. But he does note that geopolitical tensions could hamper that growth. Lee Seung-jae has more.
With the World Bank's and International Monetary Fund's spring meetings kicking off on Monday, World Bank Group President David Malpass says the global lender has revised its 2023 global growth outlook slightly upwards. Speaking at a media briefing on the same day, Malpass says the World Bank revised its 2023 growth forecast from the previous 1.7% to 2%, mainly due to an improved outlook for China's recovery from COVID-19 lockdowns. The World Bank chief also noted that advanced economies like the U.S. and those in Europe are faring a bit better than the World Bank anticipated in their January Global Economic Prospects report. However, Malpass also warned that volatility in the banking sector and higher oil prices could yet again put downward pressure on growth prospects in the second half of 2023. He also noted that a slowdown from stronger 2022 global economic growth will increase debt distress for developing countries. During the session with Malpass and IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, the two chiefs pointed out that geopolitical conflicts, like the situation in Ukraine, are putting a heavy burden on the economy and trade. Georgieva went as far as to say that the division caused by geopolitical conflicts is one of the biggest challenges the world economy needs to solve. Malpass, on the other hand, raised concerns over developing countries which have experienced capital outflows due to interest rate hikes. He also added that developing countries are suffering greatly from debt burdens, climate change, rising food prices, and slowing growth. Global economic issues will continue to be discussed during the 2023 spring meetings of the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund, which takes place from April 10th to the 16th in Washington, D.C. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
South Korea will pour over $10 billion into key sectors, including chips and secondary batteries, for the next 7 years. The ambitious plan is to bridge the gap between rivals while maximizing production. Our Moon Arirang tells us more.
South Korea's Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy held a roundtable on Monday with chief technology officers from 9 South Korean firms, including Samsung Display, Hyundai Motor and POSCO, to discuss investment plans for the year ahead. The government announced that it will be spending 70% of its annual budget for research and development across 40 different projects in 11 key investment areas, those being semiconductors, displays, secondary batteries, future mobility, core materials, advanced manufacturing, robots, aerospace and defense, advanced bio, next-generation nuclear power, and new energy industries. The ministry explained that the public and private sectors will be working together to establish clear goals and investment directions for each sector and focus their investment on selected strategic projects. In the past, the government faced criticism for its unclear approach to investments in research and development, but through collaboration with the private sector, it hopes that it will be able to invest wisely. Furthermore, a project manager group will be formed to manage the process of technological development, commercialization, and talent development. With the slump in the semiconductor industry amid falling semiconductor prices and the economic slowdown affecting exports, the government plans to invest in 4 semiconductor projects to revitalize the industry. These include developing semiconductors for mobility, energy, and home appliances, as well as pursuing semiconductor technology development projects for autonomous vehicles. As of Monday, the government has identified 34 projects to invest in. This will later be expanded to 40 projects after further consultation with experts. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the United States, at least 4 people have been killed and 9 wounded in a mass shooting at a bank. The shooting happened in the state of Kentucky in Louisville on Monday local time. 3 of the wounded are in critical condition. The gunman was using a rifle and was shot and killed by responding police officers. He was identified as a 23-year-old bank employee who had recently found out he would be fired. He is said to have left a note to family and friends suggesting his intention to carry out the shooting and live-streamed the attack. Kentucky passed a law in March prohibiting its state and local authorities from enforcing any federal restrictions related to firearms. Turning over to the war in Ukraine, Kyiv and Moscow have exchanged over 200 troops in the latest prisoner swap. According to both countries, the swap took place on Monday local time, but it's not known how it was carried out. It saw 100 Ukrainian and 106 Russian soldiers returned home. Officials from both sides say that their soldiers are in bad shape and are being treated for injuries and receiving rehabilitation. Ukrainian officials allege that some of their troops were also tortured, while Russian officials say their servicemen were in mortal danger in Ukrainian captivity. Meanwhile, in France, 5 bodies have been pulled from the rubble of a collapsed building in the city of Marseille amid ongoing search and rescue efforts. 3 people are still missing. The building came down after an explosion on Sunday morning local time, which authorities say was likely caused by a gas leak. The explosion also damaged nearby buildings, causing 2 to partially collapse a few hours later. Initial rescue efforts were hampered by dust and heat from the fire, which took a crew of 100 firefighters hours to extinguish. The disaster marks the second time in 5 years that a building has collapsed in the port city. In November 2018, 8 people were killed when 2 houses collapsed due to structural issues. And finally, Sky News Australia is quitting TikTok. The news outlet reported on Monday that it would stop publishing videos on its account, leaving behind its 65,000 followers. It cited security concerns as the main reason, alleging that the platform takes data from its users. It comes after TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, fired 4 employees in December 2022 for accessing the personal data of 2 journalists working for the Financial Times and BuzzFeed. TikTok has already been banned from official devices used by employees of several governments and organizations over allegations the app is controlled by Beijing. But TikTok maintains that the Chinese government has no control over the app. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. It's amazing to see how weather patterns can switch so quickly in just a day, from fine spring weather to a typhoon-force windy day. A wind advisory has been issued in the east and west coast regions as well as the capital area. In fact, the mountainous regions in Gangwon-do Province are seeing violent gale force winds of 110 kilometers an hour. While it could be difficult to stand without holding onto something, and even cars will not be able to drive at normal speed. And along with violent winds, rain is soaking the nation. Try not to get wet by today's rainfall. It is very likely that rain will be mixed with yellow dust today. A strong umbrella is a must, or have your raincoat ready to avoid that dusty rain. Daily highs are slightly lower in central regions, but going up as high as Monday in southern parts of the country. After the rain, colder air moves into the country, dragging down the morning temperatures to just 5 degrees Celsius here in the capital tomorrow, about 10 degrees lower than this morning. Then another band of rain is in the forecast between Friday and Saturday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of the day.